you all. It is a great honor to be here, and thank you for the very generous introduction. I wanted to talk to you about something that is based on a presentation I gave a year ago here in Mexico City, and was elaborated by Sophia and a couple of other students of mine, Talia Portney and Julian, Talia is Mexican, and Julian Urrutia is Colombian. And so I had an international group who was working on a version of these remarks which appeared in a journal called Health Systems and Reform that Michael Wright recently started. And that article, I believe, has appeared, and I will try to present some of the central ideas to you. What follows, if I can figure out how to work this. Okay. It's not working. Not working. Okay, thank you. So I wanted to begin by basically talking about the problems that this workshop and conference faces. And it's a problem that what is a combination of a threat and a promise that judicialization promises for health systems. And the backs of some of the health system defenders are raised as a result of the threat. But the promise is what, in fact, is also offered by the effort to raise issues in courts. And so one of my colleagues, Alicia Yeaman, co-authored an important book on litigating healthcare human rights, and I also am going to mention a book that two people I know, an Israeli named Ariel Gross and Colleen Flood, also published an anthology that also looked at issues about litigating human rights. And both of them came up with the view, I think, that there is both a threat and a promise of judicialization. And what I wanted to try to describe was what I think is a middle ground in this area. So my view is that if I think these proposals make sense, then I think there is a room to welcome the threat and the promise of judicialization and still have functioning healthcare systems that would result. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about what I think a moral right to health means. And this can be embedded in the Constitution as a constitutional right to health care or health. So perhaps it's my training as a philosopher, but I have always been interested in trying to translate claims about what a right is into claims about what people are entitled to. So what are the entitlements that come with a right to health? And I think if we don't know what that answer to that question is, then we don't know what the right is. So that's the first point I wanted to make. So I wanted to elaborate a little bit on what a moral right to health and healthcare should be thought of as. And an approach that I've taken to this problem over many years has used the notion of fair equality of opportunity as the impact of health people and populations, and I wanted to suggest that this is a framework within which we can think about a right to health and what the impact of and the importance, special importance, I want to argue, of health is. So the view that I'm taking would take a somewhat broadened notion of opportunity into account. We're not just talking about access to jobs and offices, but also to important aspects of life. The idea is that if we function normally, then we have a broader range of opportunities open to us than if we are disabled and seriously ill and cannot function normally. And what premature death means is that we have cut off the opportunities to pursue certain aspects of life fully. So the intuition that I'm building on is the idea that promotion of health and protection of health through both public health measures, traditional, the distribution of income and wealth and jobs and offices and opportunities and rights in a society all have an impact on the generation of health in that population, as we know from a lot of the social epidemiological literature. On the other hand, when I began this project in thinking about health, in ancient history, 30, 40, even longer years ago, I was primarily focused on health care. But even then I had a broad notion of health care. It was not just personal medicine, but public health measures that would be used. But what we've learned from the social epidemiological literature is that there are many determinants of health, and we don't know how deeply they reach into the health inequalities, aside from that socio-epidemiological literature that is emerging. One of the issues that I'm discussing with a student I'm working with now, an Oxford student, is whether the effort to ground this approach to healthcare does violence to this account of social justice that has its roots in John Rawls' theory. He thinks that I have a more encompassing problem than I am willing to admit I do. So this is an ongoing issue. So the view I have is that if we take the impact of health on opportunity as an instrumental ground for thinking about health, then health is of special importance because it protects the range of opportunities we have. And this idea, I think, can be embedded in a constitution. So the idea is that a moral right to health that arises in this way could also be a legal right to health or health care. Now, the third bullet on this overhead suggests that any notion of a right to health that is moral has to be sensitive to the resource limits that are present in a particular society. So the idea is that this moral right is progressively realizable in all health. And the notion of progressive realization, which comes out of the human rights literature, is, I think, very important to embrace in this context. So what this says is that any moral right to health has got to be sensitive to these resource limits. We can only do what we can do in health and in life. And so that's a very important lesson. The fourth bullet says that the opportunity costs of any entitlements to health or health care that come with such a right must be taken into account in thinking about what we can do. So this is going to become the basis for the claim that we need a fair deliberative process attached to health system decision-making as a way of defining what the entitlements to health are that come with a right to health care. So let me go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the conditions for a fair deliberative process. Now, part of the rationale for these conditions is that we have a lot of disagreement in societies about what the priorities ought to be. And I don't think we have adequate agreement on principles that can resolve these disputes. So I'm very skeptical of approaches that say we know that, say, seriousness of a disease is the crucial issue that we have to account for, and it ought to be a criterion for health, and we perhaps ought to decide whether a particular high-cost intervention should be approved and paid for by society on the grounds that it can relieve a very serious condition. Well, I view that as not being clear enough or defined enough to say what the criteria ought to be. Because what if this is a very prevalent condition? And so it would, providing this high-cost remedy would become very difficult for a large number of societies to do under resource constraints. We actually have real-world examples of that. In the WHO pronouncement that a range of new drugs for hepatitis C, including Salud, a very expensive drug, are on its essential drug list. Well, what does that mean for various countries facing the requirement that policy that they have had for many years to make available the drugs that are on the essential drug list domestically? So I think that you could view the issue about what to cover among these essential drugs in various ways. If you're a very wealthy country, you might say the goal of eradicating that disease of hepatitis C is worth pursuing. And you might be able to do that according to some models without necessarily treating everybody who has been tested for hepatitis C. But it would be very expensive. It would be far beyond the budget requirements or budget limits of most countries. So the picture I have is that you could back away from that requirement and still say you could make this drug available to parts of your population who don't have access to other drugs anymore. That they are, you're going to, at the extreme, rescue a few people who have advanced forms of liver disease that have resulted perhaps from the advance of the hepatitis C demand. So the picture I have is that that's going to require a political deliberation about what the goals of the society are. What do you really pursue, given that you, this is now on a global measure of an essential drug list, but how are you using it? So that issue is still up for grabs in particular countries. So the picture I have is that you cannot infer that just because this drug has been reduced by technology, it now means it's available to everyone who could benefit from it. A lot depends on other considerations, and people will disagree about those considerations, and we need a fair, deliberate process. So a colleague who is a psychiatrist at Harvard and I developed what has become known as accountability for reasonableness. If you know of a better way to refer to this and don't like the term accountability for reasonableness, please see me, because we're looking for a better terminology. But what we described were 4 conditions that any process might meet. It had to be fully transparent or public. It had to be a search for relevant conditions. It had to be revisable in light of new evidence and arguments. And the other conditions had to be met. That is, it had to be enforceable. So those were very general conditions. And the idea was to narrow the range of disagreements about what is covered. So the picture I had was that in any society, it's going to be an ongoing process to clarify what the array of services that that society can afford to provide is. And that ongoing array has to be worked out within that society under conditions that generate as much legitimacy and are as fair as they can make them. And that would depend on including, let's say, in public deliberations, a lot of stakeholders who are affected by those decisions. What I've found over the years is that there is a lot of pushback against this process. And that's in part because political systems are resistant to relegating or they're resistant to full transparency in general. And this, I think, has been a real problem in many countries. I think it's an ongoing problem in much of the region. I also think that the search for relevance is very important. So there may be disagreements on this, and that is going to require, in many cases, a kind of political solution. So the suggestion that I'm making is that we don't have any one set of requirements that would follow, but some form of process would have to be developed by a health system in order to determine what services it would provide. And I'm including public health services and medical services. So what I put on this overhead is what I hope you would walk away with as the bottom line of the presentation I'm making. It's the suggestion that we don't really know what the entitlements are that come out of claims that there's a right, or we could take this globally and call it a human right to health care. And I try to illustrate this by suggesting that imagine there's a treatment one that offers a particular individual, just call him Jack, who has, and it's his best chance, let's agree to that, for meeting the health needs he has. So that Jack has an entitlement to this treatment only if it's on, and this is the central claim that would come out of the view that I'm advocating, if it's part of a reasonable array of services meeting population health needs fairly. And what this says, so what is that array? That takes us deep into the problem of specifying what should be entitlements of an array of services be in an array of services that are provided by that health system. So the idea is that I think there's a parallel to claims about a human right. Take this to be the kind of legal right that is protected by international law. And what I'm going to suggest is that if some individual, let's refer to her as Jill, has the best chance of meeting her health needs with this treatment, then is it what she is entitled to, given that she has a human right to health? Well, what the human rights law, as I understand it, suggests is that we need a process of government deliberation to select progressively realizable rights to health in each society. And although this is referred to as an international right, ultimately the decision rests with the particular targets and goals that would be negotiated with the health system by human rights advocates in that particular setting. And my view is that that raises human rights a progressive priority setting problem that is exactly the same as the one that each society faces and that I described as what follows from a moral right to health. So the picture I have is that one can't move from the claims of a human right to health to access or an entitlement to a particular treatment unless that treatment is agreed to as part of the array of services that ought to be provided under those resource limits that that society faces. So what's the role of a health system in determining those entitlements and implementing them? And what's the role of the courts, which one might say is a defender of a constitutional right or perhaps of human rights that the state has agreed to implement? So I want to ask how a health system can improve the progressive realization of a right to health, and how the courts can improve that. And that's seeking a common ground. Is there a way that these institutions can work together and collaborate to realize that right to health? So this goes to the threat of judicialization. And some raise the concern that if the courts are asked to decide what health needs should be met, then four problems arise. They undertake a task that they're not equipped to perform, getting a reasonable allocation of healthcare resources. How do they have the capacity to determine what should be acquired? So one of the claims is that they don't have the ability to determine, the courts don't, what the opportunity costs of something are. And that has to be decided if you're going to come up with what counts as a reasonable array. A second objection is that they expose the health system to forces that can increase health inequalities, since better off people have access to the courts and litigation. So if the courts themselves are biased in favor of access to better off parts of the population, then they will be raising court suits, and if one gave into them, then one would intensify the inequalities that exist in health in that society. Third objection is that the judiciary consists of unelected officials. And this is an objection from kind of a concern that the different branches of government have different authorizations from the public and from the history, the social history of that public to participate in making decisions. So if the judiciary consists in large part of unelected but appointed positions, so that many of the judges are not elected but appointed, then why should they take over from elected officials that task? A fourth issue is whether the judiciary is more pure in some way than the political system in general. Some people think it is, and some people worry that you can have capture of the judiciary. I am worried about that coming from the United States because I've seen it at work. On the other hand, the promise is also very significant. The hope is that the judiciary could see some glaring inequalities in health status in a population and take steps to relieve them. I think the Constitutional Court in Colombia was concerned about that and took some steps to address that, and that has intensified the concern about judicialization in the region. So I think the promise is that you can improve the progressive realization of the right to health care, if that's true. So the courts could do better than health systems. And you could break out of the system the influence of the vested interests that might control a political process by having a somewhat more independent court system make those decisions. So that's the promise, that the courts could be focused on that. I want to suggest that there is a middle ground, and I think it involves the health system developing a process for making decisions about entitlements that could be deferred to by the courts and could be pointed to by the courts as an appropriate way to make those decisions that makes use of the capacities that the health system might have, but often has not properly exercised. So this requires real change on the part of the health system. And in systems such as in Mexico, and if you don't mind my saying that, coming from a country like Mexico that has a highly fragmented health system, the United States, I think there has to be better integration among the different parts of the health system in Mexico, and that the approach to what is developed as a process for adding new treatments should be something that both the Social Security system in Mexico and the Seguro Popular could agree on as an appropriate way to proceed. So the suggestion I'm making is that the health system has a lot to do if it wants to find this middle ground. It has to show that it's making some serious steps towards integrating these approaches, and it isn't doing just business as usual. The bottom line of what I'm suggesting is that the health system ought to impose the requirement that it's going to find a way to make decisions through a fair deliberative process about what the array of services it should include in, and this will be a process that ideally could be used by the various segments of the health system in Mexico. The courts, however, also have to be flexible in what they propose. And I think they should be encouraging of the health system in developing such a process, and that is what they should defer to when they look at claims about entitlements. So the picture I have is that the courts should refrain from making decisions about what treatments to cover and should encourage and put pressure on the court system to develop a process for doing that. That's going to require a lot of agreement from the courts in doing that. So this may require that the courts work with the political system to correct some of the inequalities in access to the courts that already exist. And I'm not suggesting that what has to be done in Mexico is to emulate a problematic approach that I believe the Colombians have taken with their tutelas. A particular set of lawsuits that people are encouraged to proclaim, and I wonder whether that's a generalizable solution. And I don't think it has worked to the advantage of this sort of reconciliation process I'm proposing. Let me then go on and say a couple other things about what the health system should do. It should focus on improving the system's integration, and I think this is difficult in Mexico. It's difficult any place. In a talk that I have to give in the UK in the middle of October, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the conservative government efforts to suggest that the solution to what the UK faces is inclusion of more markets and private sector participation in the health system. I don't think that would work in the UK, and I don't think that having more payers is a solution to any healthcare efforts in Mexico, in the UK. And I mention that only because you have more than enough payers in Mexico now, and the issue is getting them to work together. So I want to encourage more efforts at health system integration, and then talk a little bit more about the importance of having that process in place that I was suggesting. I think that that's what a court could defer to, and they could point to if it existed. So there has to be a clear process, and it could be that the health system doesn't have a lot of progress in integration, but has good models of what that process should look like working separately in different parts of the system. And if the courts could defer to that in their cases, that would be a first step towards saying some sort of better decision-making process by health systems and the different parts of health systems is needed. A second hope that would emerge from this is that some kinds of health inequalities or inequities that are produced by social policy are reduced by the health system. So if the health system can suggest that what it's doing in providing for its population is reducing health inequalities, then that can be another ground for the courts to defer to the health system to reduce those health inequalities. Unfortunately, what we know is that the inequalities in wealth and income that exist in many societies may trigger health inequalities that are caused by them and are not corrected by giving